Hello everyone, welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to our daily quiz. Before we look at the questions for today, please remember that we have started one-on-one counseling for UPSC aspirants. If you want to know how to prepare for the exam, just reach out to us by providing your details in the Google form, for which the link is provided in the pinned comment and in the description box below. Just share your details and our counselors will get in touch with you. So with this, let's begin with the daily quiz for today. Let's look at the first question. Consider the following statements. The SBI has recently issued AT1 bonds or additional Tier 1 bonds, which are considered to be part of Tier 1 capital. The total capital with a bank is the sum total of Tier 1 and Tier 2 capital. No bank in India has so far issued Tier 2 bonds. How many of these statements is or are correct? First, let's understand the context. Let's understand what are AT1 bonds, what is bank capital. Based on this conceptual understanding, we can easily answer this given question. I have picked this topic because there is a related article in Money Control. According to this article, SBI has raised 5,000 crores by issuing AT1 bonds at 8.34%. Now, what are AT1 bonds? What do you mean by additional Tier 1 bonds? How is it related to bank capital? That is the basic concept you need to understand. AT1 bonds are also referred to as perpetual bonds or perpetual debt instrument. It's a facility available to the bank through which it can raise additional capital to meet its capital requirement as per the Basel III norms. Under the Basel III norms, the central banks, they are mandated to ensure that all the banks maintain a minimum capital requirement. Because see, any bank will have a set of assets and a set of liabilities. Assets are nothing but the loans the bank would have given out, because for a bank, a loan is an asset that would fetch interest for the bank. So that is an asset. But any deposits, demand deposits, your saving bank account deposits, FDs, etc., those are liabilities because the bank has to pay that back to the depositor, that too whenever they demand it. So, a bank will maintain healthy capital when the asset liability difference is manageable and within the threshold as prescribed by the regulatory standards. Now, bank capital essentially refers to this difference. The difference between the assets and liabilities of a bank is the bank capital. Now, what happens if the bank's liabilities keep on increasing? Let's say the loans turn into bad loans. It becomes non-performing assets and withdrawals have gone up, which means the banks are finding it difficult to continue honoring the demand deposits, and at the same time, they're not able to make revenue. So this is where the banks will incur losses. When the bad loans increase and the demands for withdrawal also goes up, the banks will start incurring losses. But at any given situation, we can't have the bank failing. We can't allow the bank to go completely bankrupt. So that is why they need to maintain a capital. That is the bank capital. There should be a healthy balance maintained, which is nothing but the difference between the assets and liabilities. This is what we call bank capital. So as per the Basel III international norms, central banks enforce the capital requirement standards. So bank capital is made up of two types of capital. It is Tier 1 and Tier 2 capital. The sum of Tier 1, Tier 2 capital is your bank capital. And within Tier 1, there are two types. We have AT1, additional Tier 1, and CET1, common equity Tier 1. Tier 1 capital is what is first used by the bank to meet any immediate capital requirements. Let's say the bank starts suffering losses. In order to consolidate its position and to balance the asset liability mismatch, the banks will first tap into Tier 1 capital because this is more liquid, it is more readily available. It is held in the form of different instruments. There will be debt instruments, government securities, right? And two major types of Tier 1 capital is CET, Common Equity Tier 1, where the banks would have raised debt capital by issuing equity shares. And AT1, additional tier 1, these are perpetual bonds which are issued. Usually you know that bank bonds, they come with a maturity period. The banks are supposed to pay back the investor at that maturity date with the interest rate as well. But in case of AT1 bond, there is no maturity date. Banks can decide when they will pay back the investor. So this gives banks more flexibility. They will for sure know that this is the capital left with them. They can tap into it whenever they want, whenever there is a crisis that is being faced by the bank. Then comes tier 2 capital, which is a supplementary capital. RBI has mandated, as per Basel III norms, that banks can first rely on tier 1 capital, which is more liquid, more readily available, and it's more stable as well. But after that, beyond a certain threshold, banks can tap into supplementary capital, which is tier 2 capital. So this is something very basic that you need to understand about the banking system. Now coming back to the given question, the first statement is obviously correct. SBI has recently issued 81 bonds worth 5,000 crores and it is considered as part of tier 1 capital. That's what we learned. Total capital with the bank, it's the sum of tier 1, tier 2 capital. Again, a correct statement. Third statement says no bank in India has so far issued tier 2 or T2 bonds. This statement is wrong. It's incorrect. Because few banks in India, including Dena Bank, they have raised capital through tier 2 bonds as well. Alright. So how many statements are correct? Only 2. Option B becomes the right answer. Now, question number 2. Consider the following with regard to WTO peace clause. It was introduced in Bali Ministerial Conference. The clause provides protection to both developed and developing countries. India is the first country to invoke the peace clause. How many of these statements are incorrect? First, let's understand the context. Let's understand the concept behind it, and then we will check whether the statements are correct or incorrect. See, I've picked this topic because we have an article in the Indian Express, according to which India has been pushing WTO members for a permanent solution for public stock holding. In few days, the 13th WTO Ministerial Conference is going to be held in Abu Dhabi. WTO Ministerial Conferences, they are held once in 2 years. And in the run-up to this event, India has raised the issue of public stock holding limits, the subsidies we provide in agriculture, and we are asking the WTO members, especially the developed countries, to work towards finding a permanent solution for public stock holding. Now, what is this issue all about? As you know, WTO, the World Trade Organization, provides a level playing field with regard to world trade. It helps in settling trade disputes, in tackling unfair trade practices and trade distorting practices. Under WTO, we have the Agreement on Agriculture that specifically deals with issues in the agriculture sector. So under the Amber Box agreements that deal with Agreement on Agriculture, there is a provision related to subsidies that governments provide for agriculture. Now, for example, in India, the government of India provides subsidies to farmers in the form of MSP, minimum support price. This guarantees a minimum income to the farmers, a guaranteed income. It encourages farmers to grow certain kinds of crops as well, because those crops for which MSP is announced, and if the MSP is attractive, farmers will be incentivized to grow those crops more, be it rice, wheat, etc. This also helps in building up public stock holding. It helps in procuring essential food grains to create a buffer stock which is maintained by the Food Corporation of India. Essentially, the MSP, minimum support price, is the price at which the government will buy the agricultural produce from the farmers. That's the guaranteed minimum rate. So this guarantees more income to the farmers as well, right? In a way, it becomes a subsidy for the farmers. At the same time, it helps in building up public stock holding, in creating the food grain stock, which is crucial for meeting the food security needs of the country. Correct? So India being a developing country, India feels that these subsidies are necessary for farmers to support our farmers and agriculture, to boost agricultural productivity. And India also believes that these subsidies are needed to build up our public stock holding, to ensure that we have enough food stocks so that we can run the food security programs that we have, like public distribution system, and meet the requirements under National Food Security Act, etc. We have schemes like Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana, where subsidized food grains are distributed to the poor. So to ensure food security, especially for the poor people in a developing nation, such subsidies play a critical role in building up public stock holding. But developed countries don't agree with this. Developed countries have a problem with the agricultural subsidies. Now, if you look at, let's say, US, European countries, Australia, New Zealand, all these developed countries, they argue that subsidies given by countries like India is distorting the agriculture market. They call India's MSP as trade distorting practice. Why? Now imagine if Government of India is providing a higher MSP for, let's say, rice or wheat. It will incentivize our farmers to grow more rice and wheat, right? So the production increases, the supply increases, the cost will go down. And eventually, India's rice and wheat, which we export, will also be cheaper than what other countries can produce. So this makes it more competitive. And as a result, Indian rice and wheat can dominate the global market. So developed countries argue that this is trade distorting. The government is giving this support in an unfair manner, which is making their product more competitive. And thus, it affects the market available for the other countries. So that is why they challenge this at WTO. But developing nations like India, they dismiss this. They say that it is necessary for us, not just to support our farmers and agriculture, but more importantly, to build our public stock holding, because these food grains are critical for food security in a poor country, in a developing nation. So this has been a long-standing issue. So in 2013, during the Bali Ministerial Conference of WTO, the WTO members agreed for a peace clause. Now, what is this peace clause? Let me explain. See, through WTO negotiations under Agreement on Agriculture, the subsidy cap is limited to 10% of the value of agricultural production of that country. WTO rules states that countries cannot provide subsidies to agriculture beyond 10% of their total value of agricultural production. Let's say India has produced 100 crores worth of rice or wheat. The subsidy that we provide cannot cross 10 crore rupees. Until 10 crores, subsidy is acceptable, but beyond that, it's not acceptable. But as a developing nation which is struggling with food security and trying to support farmers, we often provide much more subsidies than that through MSP. India says our support is somewhere in the range of 13 to 15%, which is beyond the WTO limit. Now, since we are crossing the WTO limit, what will happen? Developed countries can file cases against India. They can allege that this is a trade distorting practice by India whenever we breach the 10% cap on subsidies, and they can file cases at the WTO, thus triggering a trade dispute. So, at the Bali Ministerial, a peace clause was agreed to. In order to meet the food security needs of poor developing nations, WTO members agreed for a peace clause, according to which, even if a developing nation breaches the 10% cap, then developed nations cannot file cases. That is what the peace clause says, which was adopted at the Bali Ministerial. This was a temporary solution, since developing nations kept arguing that we need protection. We need to ensure we continue subsidies to our farmers to ensure food security, right? So they kept arguing this, and hence a temporary solution was given that even if you cross 10% of the subsidy limit, then cases cannot be filed. Essentially, it gives you immunity against trade disputes. This was the peace clause of Bali Ministerial. It was a temporary solution, and The hope was a permanent solution will be worked out in the future. But now, there has been no permanent solution. WTO promised that within 5 years we'll work out a temporary solution and we'll change that to a permanent solution. But till date, there has been no permanent solution, mainly due to differences between developed countries and developing nations. India even used the permanent clause. The peace clause which is available, India has invoked it before. Because many years we have breached the 10% subsidy limit. So to protect ourselves from trade disputes, we have invoked the peace clause, and thus other countries have not been able to file trade disputes against India. But now India is pushing for a permanent solution. We are saying temporary solution will not work. We want a permanent solution. So this again has divided the developed and developing countries, which is always the case at WTO. Now let's take a look at the question. First statement is definitely correct. The WTO peace clause was introduced in 2013 at the Bali Ministerial Conference. Second statement, however, is wrong. I just told you the peace clause provides protection only to developing countries which breach the 10% subsidy cap. It does not provide any protection to developed countries. India is the first country to invoke the peace clause? Yes. In 2018-19, when India breached the subsidy limit, we became the first developing nation to invoke the WTO peace clause. So 1 and 3 are correct. But question is asking how many of the statements are incorrect. So it's only 1. Option A becomes the correct answer. Now let's look at question number 3. In which of the following Latin American countries is there a large presence of the Indian community which can be attributed to the indentured labor system of the British? There are 5 countries mentioned here. We need to check in how many of these countries you find a large Indian community which is attributed to the indentured labor system of the British. Now, why did I pick this question? In today's Press Information Bureau, there is a press release which says that the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has shared few bhajans from the Indian community in Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago. In the run-up to the consecration of the Ram temple at Ayodhya, a lot of cultural events are being organized around the world within the Indian diaspora. And the Indian community in Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago, they have shared few bhajans which has been further shared by the Prime Minister as well. This highlights the deep-rooted cultural ties and soft power links that we have with many Latin American countries. So let's understand this important connection in more detail. Now when we say Latin America, this geographical reference, it refers to South America, and it also includes Central America. It includes Mexico as well from North America, and the Caribbean region, the Caribbean islands. This is what you mean by the Latin American region. So here there are several countries where there is a strong Indian community. Because back in 1800s, during the colonial period, when slavery, African slavery was abolished with the British Parliament, the British colonial enterprises, they needed cheap labor to replace the African slaves. So they came up with the indentured labor system, through which largely Indian laborers were transported to British colonies around the world. They needed cheap labor to run their plantations, their crops, their factories, etc. So in many cases, they would forcefully transport Indian families. In some cases, they would dupe Indian families by promising a lucrative job abroad, and they would sign these contracts and they would dump them in these colonies located far away from the country. So that is the reason why there is a strong Indian community present in many faraway islands which were once British colonies. For example, look at Pacific countries like Fiji. Fiji even today has a very large Indian community. These were Indians who were transported with the British almost 2 centuries ago. Look at Mauritius, located far away in the Indian Ocean, closer to Africa. But majority of the population in Mauritius is of Indian origin. That's because these are all descendants of Indian laborers who were transported under the Indian indentured labor system, right? So similarly, many Indians were transported to Latin America as well. Today you find them in many countries, including Guyana. It was then British Guyana, which is locked in a border dispute with Venezuela. In Suriname, in South America, in French Guyana as well. Then across the Caribbean islands, in Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, right? What we refer to as the West Indies, in St. Kitts and Nevis, and in many other Caribbean countries, you find a very strong Indian community. You find close connections with India, cultural connections, be it Hinduism or the Hindi language, our food, our cultural customs, they are still very much practiced here by the Indian community. I'm sure many of you would have seen the similarities in the West Indies cricket team. A number of popular West Indian cricketers, they have an Indian origin name. That's not a coincidence. It's because there has been a large Indian community here, right? So across Caribbean, across these countries like Jamaica, Guyana, Suriname, French Guyana, right? And even Trinidad, Tobago, St. Kitts and Nevis. In all these countries, there is a strong Indian community which is attributed to the indentured labor system of the British. So based on this, we can easily eliminate Bolivia. Bolivia doesn't have a major Indian community which is attributable to the indentured labor system. So take out Bolivia. Suriname, correct. Jamaica, Guyana, Trinidad, Tobago. All these four are correct. So 1, 2, 4 and 5. Option C is the right answer. Next, question number 4. India's decision to quit RCEP was based on concerns about flood of cheap imports, impact on domestic products and industries, fears that India's trade deficit with China would increase. Now, what is RCEP? RCEP is considered as the world's largest free trade agreement. In today's The Hindu Business Line, there is an article that India did well in not joining RCEP. RCEP was primarily a China-led free trade agreement, and 16 countries were part of these negotiations. But eventually, India decided to quit the negotiations in 2019. On certain grounds, India was not satisfied with RCEP negotiations, so India quit the trade negotiations. We are no longer a part of it. But the other 15 countries, they went ahead, they have signed the free trade agreement, and today this is the world's largest FTA. It nearly represents 30% of the global population and the global GDP. So it's led by China, and there are 10 Southeast Asian countries which are ASEAN members. That is Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Myanmar, Vietnam, Philippines, Laos, Brunei. These 10 ASEAN members are part of it, along with Japan, South Korea, and as well as Australia and New Zealand. So these are the 15 countries part of the Pacific which are members of RCEP. Now the question is, why did India quit RCEP? India quit RCEP because we had certain legitimate concerns. Previously, we had a bitter experience with an FTA that we had signed with ASEAN countries. We realized that if FTAs are not well negotiated, it might benefit the other party unfairly. It might open up our markets to a flood of cheaper imports from the other countries. So as a result, our domestic producers and industries might suffer. Our farmers, our MSME industry might suffer. And more importantly, our trade deficit will shoot up as the imports will increase. And especially with China. China, which has already dumped goods on the Indian market, could further leverage the FTA and further dump goods on the Indian market, further increasing the trade deficit, which it might misuse for geopolitical reasons as well. So because of all these concerns and few other related issues, India quit RCEP negotiations. So all the three are correct. Option C is the right answer. Now, let's take up a practice question from the 2017 prelims paper. It's from Environment and Ecology. From the ecological point of view, which one of the following assumes importance in being a good link between the Eastern Ghats and the Western Ghats? Is it Satyamangalam Tiger Reserve, the Nalamala Forest, Nagarhole National Park, Sheshachalam Biosphere Reserve? The correct answer is option A. The Satyamangalam Tiger Reserve in Tamil Nadu forms an ecological link connecting Eastern Ghats and Western Ghats. It's a very important wildlife corridor as well. It's a migratory corridor for tigers, elephants, etc. And it serves as a genetic link connecting the ecosystems of Western Ghats and Eastern Ghats. Alright, now please find out where the other three national parks and protected areas are located, in which state, and mention that in the comments. Let me know where Nalamala Forest is found in which state Nagarhole National Park is located, and in which state Sheshachalam Biosphere Reserve is located. Please mention that in the comments. Now coming to the last part of the discussion, the fact of the day. Today we have an article in the Hindu Business Line and in few other newspapers as well that refers to a very important terminology which is seen in news called greenwashing. So you should understand what is greenwashing and why is it in news. The term is in news because the ASCI, the Advertising Standards Council of India, has introduced guidelines to prevent greenwashing in advertisements. The ASCI is the regulator of advertisements in the country. If any company is falsely promoting products, or if it's promoting misleading advertisements, ASCI will issue guidelines and it will take action against such companies and products as well. Now, the question here is about greenwashing. What is greenwashing? Greenwashing is a questionable practice followed by many companies in the country and the world, where they try to oversell the environmental advantages of their product. Now, some companies might say their product is biodegradable. Some might say claim that it is completely recyclable or it is non-toxic, right? They might change the packaging, deliberately add more green color in the packaging as well, make misleading advertisements to show that the carbon footprint of the product is less or emissions associated with that product is less. So they might do this to project that the product is environment friendly and sustainable. Because as the world is concerned about global warming and environmental issues, the public, the customers would be more inclined to buy products which are more environment friendly. So many companies are trying to capitalize on this and they mislead the customer. They misdirect the customer by falsely claiming environmental benefits, by falsely claiming or misleading the consumers that the product has a greater impact, a positive impact on the environment. This practice is called greenwashing. So ASCI has issued guidelines to prevent companies from doing it, and it's going to impose the guidelines all across the life cycle of that product, right from the product being produced to the product being packaged to being sold and eventual disposal of that product. Covering the whole life cycle of that product, guidelines are being issued only if it meets those certain standards of production, packaging, recycling, etc. Only then companies can claim that the product is environment friendly. Is that clear? So these guidelines have been issued to prevent misleading advertisements, right, that claim that the products are environment friendly. So this is what you should know about greenwashing. So with this, I complete the discussion for today. I hope you've understood all the topics. And if you like the session, do let me know in the comments. Press the like button and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. That is it for watching. Thank you. We'll see you again.